The year is 1917. A German sentry stands watch in a muddy trench, straining his eyes into the darkness. He never sees the blackened face that rises silently behind him. A hand clamps over his mouth, a swift move with a blade, and he's done before he can alert anyone. The rest of the raiders slip into the trench, and the carnage begins. Grenades, clubs, knives, and pistols are the weapons of choice for the brutal hand-to-hand combat that ensues. Within minutes, the mission is complete, and survivors drag prisoners back across no man's land while the whole front erupts behind them. Today, you'll hear the dark story of trench raiders, the special forces of World War I, and their insane actions and tactics that were conveniently omitted and overshadowed. Let's begin. Trench raiding was the practice of conducting small-scale surprise attacks on enemy trenches, typically at night. By 1915, a 400-mile network of trenches stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, creating the infamous Western Front. New weapons had changed warfare forever. Machine guns and artillery rained down destruction with unprecedented power, and fighting from protected positions became the only viable option, as frontal assaults resulted in catastrophic casualties. It took hundreds of thousands of lives for military commanders to realize that sending waves of men charging across no man's land would result in everyone dying. They needed another approach. All sides sought intelligence about enemy positions and a way to maintain pressure without launching costly full-scale attacks. So instead, they sent small groups of men into enemy territory to gather intelligence, capture prisoners for interrogation, destroy equipment, and spread fear and chaos, at least in theory. What began as improvised night attacks evolved into sophisticated operations. However, the real story behind them was much darker than the successes reported back at headquarters. By mid-1915, specialized close combat tactics had become formalized, taught at command schools, and published in military manuals. Trench raiding had become a military science, but they were far from the exciting missions they were portrayed as, with more of them ending in complete catastrophe than completing their objectives. The first raids were poorly planned and executed by whoever volunteered, but as commanders recognized their value, specialized units emerged. They were trained to maximize damage while minimizing time spent in enemy territory, often just minutes from entry to exit. They perfected silent movement, rapid execution, and the crucial surprise element that left enemy forces in disarray. However, it was far more complicated than it sounds. The British, Canadians, Australians, and Germans all developed specialized raiding tactics. The Germans created the Sturm Company, the infamous stormtroopers who would later influence military doctrine for decades. Selected raiders, usually volunteers, received special privileges like better food, more rest, and additional leave, compensating for the extreme dangers they faced. They trained on mock trenches, learning how to coordinate in darkness and silence, and most importantly, hand-to-hand combat, how to kill efficiently and silently. Let's go over their weapons, then tactics, and then some missions that will make your skin crawl. Instead of rifles, machine guns, and artillery, trench raiders preferred something a bit more personal. Weapons better suited for silent close-quarters killing in the confined space of trenches. Trench clubs were the preferred option, a simple 40-centimeter wooden handle or even a spring for extra whiplash effect, with nails, spikes, or metal studs creatively hammered into one end. Unlike a bayonet that might get stuck in a ribcage or a pistol that would alert the entire trench, clubs were silent and effective. One good swing, and there goes the sentry. Raiders also carried specialized fighting knives, like the US M1917 Knuckle Duster trench knife, daggers, and even sharpened shovels. Pistols and revolvers provided backup when stealth was compromised, and there was nothing better for clearing dugouts and creating chaos than grenades, which raiders carried by the dozen. So imagine using this on another human in what was then considered modern times. Actually, you don't need to imagine because we'll now explain that. Picture this. It's 2 a.m. You're smeared head to toe in mud and coal dust to break up your outline. Your heart is pounding so hard you're convinced the Germans can hear it from their trenches. It's time. 0 hour. You slide silently over the parapet, go through the prepared narrow path through the barbed wire of your trench, and begin the crawl across no man's land. But no man's land was a decomposing open graveyard. You're crawling through mud, barbed wire, and water-filled shell craters mixed with what was left of soldiers from previous unsuccessful actions. With nerves of steel, you have to watch every move. No sound could be made. Occasional flares light up no man's land like it's day for a few seconds, and you have to be absolutely motionless. If one of your comrades makes a wrong move, you're all done. Both sides would start shooting, artillery would rain in, and that's the end of your mission. And many missions ended exactly like that. Inch by inch, you try not to get entangled in barbed wire, cutting it without a click being heard. But the crossing is just the beginning. You're now a couple of feet away from a sentry, probably hearing him breathe as he stares in your direction but doesn't see your mud-smeared face. He looks away. Now it's time. You jump into the trench directly on top of him, grabbing his mouth and silencing him. You pause for a moment to assess the situation, breathing heavily. All clear. Other members of your group are now in the trench, and chaos begins, executing carefully rehearsed plans. Teams move in different directions, securing the entry point, while others push down the trench lines. A series of grenades are thrown methodically into dugouts, creating a complete confusion. With speed and surprise as their main weapons, they quickly complete what they came for, destroying equipment, snatching a so-called live tongue, and taking any papers and documents they might find. Now the whole front knows they're here, and reinforcements from the second trench line are coming any moment now. After just a couple of minutes, it's time to go back. And now begins the most dangerous part, getting back to your trench now that you've awakened the whole front. Enemy reinforcements might arrive too quickly, or the withdrawal could be cut off by a curtain of artillery fire. Also, wounded raiders often couldn't be retrieved. If a man was injured in enemy trenches or no man's land, his comrades had the choice of risking additional lives to save him or leaving him behind. With the entire enemy line alert, flares were fired, illuminating no man's land, and machine guns opened up. Raiders retreating with prisoners now had to find a way back somehow. Commanders established passwords with friendly sentries before raids so they would recognize the raiding party returning from a mission. But miscommunication could happen in the chaos and dark, or word that the party was out didn't reach some trench sections. Nervous sentries fired on anything moving in no man's land, and it wasn't rare that those were their returning comrades. Some got disoriented and lost their sense of direction, jumping into a trench with a sense of relief, only to hear a familiar language, but not of their nation. Others got entangled in barbed wire and obstacles, becoming easy targets. If by some miracle you survived through all this and you're now in the relative safety of your trench again, trying to catch your breath, you know that what you did and saw would haunt you as long as you live, and that may be just until the next raid you're sent on. Many missions ended catastrophically for raiders. It wasn't rare for the whole party to go out and never return, sometimes without anyone knowing what had actually happened to them in the dark. They simply never came back. Now let's examine a real-world example. On February 17, 1917, the 4th Battalion, Duke of Wellington's regiment, conducted a successful raid near Arras in France. Their mission was to secure identification by capturing a German prisoner. This meant they needed a live soldier to determine which unit was occupying a particular section of the front line and potentially learn their strength and intentions. At 9:45 p.m., a raiding party of 76 officers and men under Captain Moet assembled in no man's land. Earlier, fighter patrols had checked for German activity between the trenches, and a 6-man team had cut and marked a path through the outer layers of German barbed wire. The raiding party was divided into specialized teams with precise roles. The torpedo party was tasked with breaching the main German wire using a 22-foot Bangalore torpedo. This was a tube filled with explosives. The idea was to push the tube through a barbed wire entanglement and then blow it up to create a path. Left and right flank parties of 12 men each would clear trenches in both directions and establish blocking positions. The dugout clearing party was responsible for throwing grenades into German shelters. Another 12 men would push down the central communication trench, while the parapet party of 14 men would secure the entry point, provide security, and handle prisoners. At precisely 10 p.m., supporting artillery began firing a pre-registered barrage along the German front line. Second Lieutenant Hurst and his engineer team moved forward with the Bangalore torpedo, struggling to position it in the thick German wire. After detonating the explosive, they found it hadn't fully cleared the obstacle. Captain Moet and Sergeant Moskrup led the way, using billhooks to hack through the remaining wire. Sergeant Moskrup was the first into the trench, immediately encountering 3 German sentries. 2 were neutralized and 1 was taken prisoner. The left and right flank parties pushed down the trench in both directions, encountering resistance. When Germans blocked their advance, half of the flanking parties moved along the parapet and dropped into the trench behind the Germans, attacking them from the rear. Meanwhile, the dugout clearing party methodically bombed German shelters. The communication trench party couldn't find their objective, so they assisted with clearing dugouts instead. After just 18 minutes in the enemy trench, Captain Moet judged they had accomplished their mission. They had secured a prisoner for identification and bombed all the dugouts they could find. At 10:18 p.m., buglers sounded the recall signal and the raiders withdrew in sequence. By 10:29 p.m., the entire raiding party had crossed no man's land and returned to British trenches. 7 men were wounded, with 1 later dying of his wounds. The Germans suffered at least 17 confirmed dead, plus untold casualties in the bombed dugouts. However, for every celebrated operation like this, dozens of small-scale raids ended with entire teams slaughtered in no man's land or captured in enemy trenches. These missions were systematically erased from official narratives as inconvenient failures that didn't fit the heroic story commanders wanted to tell. Surviving trench raiders returned home with memories that civilian society couldn't comprehend. Many took these horrors to their graves, unable to speak of what they had seen and done in the midnight hours of the Western Front. Yet trench raiding was a unique tactic and would even influence special operations in future conflicts. The midnight raid, the element of surprise, the targeted violence, these concepts remain exactly the same in modern special forces doctrine. We've replaced clubs with silenced weapons and night vision goggles, but we're never really far from brutal medieval combat.